Okay. Well, what I wanted to do today was sort of a response to an experience I had when I was Jim's postdoc. And Stuart Pym was visiting, and my wife was in our office, opposite Jim's office, in the old part of the biology building. And Jim was describing some of his new theoretical ideas, and Stuart Pym finally looked at him and said, "Nobody will ever call you a reductionist." And when I first came up with the idea for this paper, that sort of memory came back to my mind, and I hope you guys will see why, because what I'm going to talk about today is how old ideas from indigenous people can be combined with some of the newest theoretical ideas that are coming out of Western science. Constructal law is essentially an idea that's been developed very recently by an engineer at Duke University who was attending a talk in Switzerland and decided that it was about the necessity of fractals and how everything was random in nature, and he was studying basically heat conduction, and he decided that that didn't make a lot of sense from the way he was viewing things. So that what he did was come up with what he regarded as being a new law, or almost a third law of thermodynamics, and that is for a finite-sized flow system to persist in time, and he defines that as living. That is a flow system that persists is actually a living system. It has to evolve in such a way that provides the easiest access to the currents that flow through it. So, like I said, he regards this in some ways as a third law of thermodynamics. I don't know enough about physics to actually evaluate this particular idea, but I think it's a real important one, because what he's saying here is that this idea of flow and the way in which flow essentially evolves to generate what he refers to as design is a universal phenomenon that's not covered by the first and second laws of thermodynamics. It's the generation of configuration or the generation of design in nature. And I want to emphasize here, and he makes the point repeatedly, this has nothing to do with intelligent design. This has to do with the way that the deterministic systems evolve within living systems. And so he says that this universal phenomena is then covered by this constructal law. It accounts for a natural tendency in time, so that is, from existing flow configurations, easier flow configurations will appear over time, and this is distinct from the natural tendencies that are summarized by the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, here's an example of what we're talking about here. Flow systems tend to assume the same sort of shape, and there has been a tendency in the past to view this as being sort of a random phenomena. In fact, a number of people have talked a great deal about the randomness of these types of systems. In fact, these systems actually turn out to be much more deterministic. On the left, we have the delta of the Lena River in Russia. On the right, we have a lung. And you look at these, you see that essentially the flow systems that exist within them, that the physics phenomena of generation of configuration both unifies and facilitates the circuit that's executed by anything that flows. Water being the basic model, however, in the case of on the right, where you're looking at a lung, you can also see air flowing through a system. All right, how does this relate to indigenous people and their thinking? Well, in indigenous traditions, one of the sort of an old idea that may be as old, almost as old as mankind itself, is what they refer to as the beginning law. And that is that life has a basic drive to live. It needs to be embodied to live, and that somehow this keeps finding its way back into living states. So if you're looking at the components of living systems, that they have ways of working their ways back into states of existence and of life. And life then exists in a state of continual metamorphosis, of which both birth and death are but two steps, which is illustrated pretty well in this Anishinaabe artwork here on sort of the life cycle of a goose. Now, one of the things that's key in all this is that when you're talking about life here, when you're talking about these flow systems, and this is how it converges on the constructal law, is that life can change bodies and species as it progresses through time. And essentially indigenous people tend to have some very basic concepts. They consider life to include anything that flows. Now this obviously includes things like animals and plants. Indigenous people tend not to talk about microorganisms. They're aware of their existence, but they're not part of the way that they normally talk about things. But they also consider water, stone, and air to be flowing systems, and in their way of thinking things about as being living systems. Now the interesting thing about this is that, to me, these are the four basic elements that we hear about all the way back to early Greek philosophy on fire, water, earth, and air, except that in the case of animals and plants, what we're not doing, the fire is sort of a cliche. That what we're talking about is fire. When we talk about fire, is we're talking about the energy that's contained within living systems and how the chemical processes by which energy is generated and produced in living systems are very, very similar to, and especially the way it's broken down, to the chemical processes involved in fire. So, flow is life. Indigenous people believe that water is a living system. And you look at these illustrations on the left that are generated by simulations and simulations above, experiments below on generating flow systems using water, by people working on constructal theory. You look at sort of the oxbow, this complex oxbow on the right. The important principle here is that what generates all these configurations is deterministic. That these systems below, especially the ones below, which are actual results of experiments, can be reproduced in every frame when the erosion simulation process is repeated on the same basin. All right, we tend not to think of stone or earth as flowing, but it clearly does, especially in certain circumstances. And there's a tendency to view rock as solid, but like I said, if you can see here in the case of this lava, and also here in the case of this sort of limestone cave, flow is a very important component of stone and its existence, particularly when it's influenced by things like wind, water, and heat, as we just talked about before. Now, for a local example of the sort of thing I'm talking about 60 miles northwest of here, we have El Malpais National Monument. This area is basically categorized or exemplified primarily by these lava flows that come down, and they've been dated to about 3,000 years ago, which is a time when there are a number of indigenous people living in this area as there are today. And these were around Sudzil, or Mount Taylor as it was renamed after this area was colonized. But the interesting thing is that the metaphor that the Dene people used to characterize the lava bed in El Malpais is this is blood that has flown from a monster slain by their hero twins. And so this clearly demonstrates that they view rock as potentially being a flowing system and one that existed as a liquid when they first experienced it. Now the Dene people were not here at that time. So life is sort of cycle and flow. The beginning law links to the constructal law because both are essentially exploring the same phenomena. That is, how living systems are generated and perpetuated. Everything that moves and morphs in order to flow and persist is alive according to both of these raw laws, the beginning law and the constructal law. This also explains, as I've just been mentioning, why indigenous cultures regard air, water, and stone as also being alive in many ways. It also negates the need, especially the deterministic aspects that emerge from the constructal law. It negates the need to invoke random processes in the generation of structure and change. This includes Steve Gould's idea that evolution is a completely random process, and Adrian Bejan has developed constructal law as a response to the supposed random nature of fractal geometry. So, I want to close here with two examples of how I think this sort of thing gives us new insight into some really crucial formula in evolution. The first of these is endosymbiosis. And to me, endosymbiosis is strongly linked to the beginning law because it shows the way in which living systems sort of struggle to persist even under unusual circumstances and sometimes generate unusual results. Because with endosymbiosis, we have the situation whereby prokaryotic organisms have been taken into other prokaryotic organisms to generate the earliest eukaryotic organisms. This is one of the most important, if not the most important event in the history of the evolution of living forms on this planet. And yet, it's a really interesting phenomena, and it's one that I use as an evolutionary biologist working in the state of Kansas. If you want to devastate a creationist, try to get him to explain this one. Try to get him to explain why most of the DNA in our bodies actually comes from prokaryotic rather than eukaryotic sources. And they have no answer. In fact, basically their attempt is to try to deny it. When you show them the evidence, they just sort of shake their heads and walk away. So that one of the things I want you guys to realize and think about here is that these important events, the second event is one that we make a big deal out of, and unfortunately that slide is slightly off, is the creation of the human brain, which many of us, especially, again, a lot of creationists tend to regard as being one of the major evolutionary events in all time. Well, actually, what's happened is back in the early 2000s, there was a crucial discovery made, and we have heard people talk today in various contexts about papers that sort of have become neglected and nobody's quite sure why. To me, this is one of the most important papers that's been published, and yet almost nobody talks about it, and it has not made its way into evolutionary textbooks. What basically these people demonstrated is that if you look at the skulls and the jaw muscles of humans and other primates, that there was a major mutation that happened that other primates like anthropoid apes and even the macaques and all have very, very strong, dense jaw muscles. This is the size of the basic units in their jaw muscles. This is the size of the same unit in a human jaw muscle, and this is the structure of human jaw muscles in consequence. You can look at this. This isn't real obvious and isn't see, but basically there was a single mutation that happened about 3 million years ago, 2.5, 3 million years ago, where this happened. And after that, we started seeing the occurrence of larger brain, dome-skulled individuals. Well, the irony is we've always assumed this was a result of some sort of major selection. What it now looks like happened is that what happened is we actually got, rather than new evolution, we got a deconstraint. We got weak jaws. What happens with weak jaws? You get weak jaw muscles. Strong jaw muscles require a strong sagittal crest at the top of the skull, which serves as an attachment point. If you release the need or sort of remove the need for having that strong sagittal crest, the top of the cranium can expand and become more round, and that then allows a much larger brain size. So that what we're looking at here is kind of a really interesting accident that was turned into an incredible opportunity by our own species, and that originally the weakened jaw muscles may actually have been strongly selected against, but the increased brain size may have been strongly selected for, so that we have this push and pull between advantage and disadvantage in this sort of situation. But the key thing is that the human cranium was allowed to increase in size and become rounded because it no longer had to have a sagittal crest for the attachment of these huge jaw muscles that were dependent upon, great strength for chewing and all. So human brain size is not really an accident, but it's a result of changes in design constraint, and there doesn't seem to have been any mutation on the bone structure. The mutation actually occurred in a muscle that we don't normally associate with the brain itself, but that this changed design constraints that allowed skull shape to change and allowed increased cranial capacity. Now, having said that, let's take a look at a situation. What are the typical American responses to the constructal law and the beginning law? when it comes to constructal law, how does America, especially we in the West, feel about flow? We try to regulate it. We try to constrain it. We don't want it to take its natural abilities, so that we essentially destroy a lot of the structure that would emerge from the constructal law. And when it comes to the beginning law, that is the desire or the sort of the impetus for life to return to life as soon as possible through things breaking down, what do? We try to create airtight coffins that will prevent decay, so that the idea being that human corpses will not be allowed to return to their natural state, will not be allowed to return to other living systems, and will not be allowed to sort of be restored to life in this type of situation. So let me close with this image here, which I think shows a great deal of what I've been talking about with the constructal law, but in the context of the beginning law, by showing you this image of the Malpais at sunset. So you can see the constructal law in the tendency, the branching shapes of the trees, and the other vegetation in the lava bed itself. And also at the same time, you can see the beginning law in the nature and the basic struggle of these living systems to persist in a very, very harsh living system. Thank you very much.